Have you ever wondered why the Indian constitution looks familiar to many constitutional systems around the world? Some people even say that the Indian constitution is a borrowed constitution. But is it really just copied from other countries, or is there something more thoughtful behind it? Welcome to PS Choudhary. Before we begin today's topic, let us briefly recall what we studied in the previous lecture. In the previous video, we discussed the key committees of the Constituent Assembly. We saw that the Assembly created several committees to divide the massive task of drafting the Constitution. Among them, the most important was the Drafting Committee, chaired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. This committee converted the recommendations of various committees into the final legal text of the Constitution. It studied constitutional systems from many countries and carefully drafted the provisions that suited India's needs. Now this naturally leads us to the next topic. If the drafting committee studied many constitutions, then what were the sources of the Indian constitution? Let us understand this clearly. The framers of the Indian constitution were extremely well-read scholars. They carefully examined the constitutions of more than 60 countries across the world. But they did not simply copy these constitutions. Instead, they selected features that suited India's historical conditions, political realities, and social needs. So it was not blind copying. It was intelligent adaptation. This is a very important point for UPSC. When writing answers in the mains examination, you should emphasize that the Constitution of India borrowed ideas from many countries but modified them to suit Indian conditions. Now let us look at the major sources one by one. First, the most important source of the Indian Constitution was the Government of India Act of 1935. In fact, many structural features of the Constitution were directly derived from this act. These include the federal structure of government, emergency provisions, the system of public service commissions, and the idea of a federal court, which later evolved into the Supreme Court of India. The act also influenced the role of the governor in the states, the system of 3 legislative lists, the concept of residuary powers with the centre, and the idea of a bicameral legislature at the central level. So remember this clearly. The Government of India Act of 1935 provided the administrative and institutional framework on which the Constitution was built. Now let us move to the United Kingdom. From the British constitutional system, India borrowed the parliamentary form of government. Under this system, the real executive power lies with the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, who are collectively responsible to the lower house of Parliament. Another feature borrowed from the United Kingdom is the cabinet system. The concept of a nominal head of state also comes from the British model. In Britain, the monarch is the nominal head, while the Prime Minister exercises real executive power. Similarly, in India, the President is the nominal head, while the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers exercise real authority. Other features borrowed from the United Kingdom include the rule of law, the system of single citizenship, the use of constitutional writs such as habeas corpus, the bicameral legislature, the office of the Speaker in Parliament, and the office of the Comptroller and Auditor General. Now let us move to the United States of America. Several important constitutional ideas were borrowed from the American system. One of the most important is the concept of fundamental rights. These rights are justiciable, meaning they can be enforced in courts. Another idea borrowed from the United States is the concept of judicial review. This allows the judiciary to examine the constitutionality of laws passed by the legislature. India also adopted the idea of an independent judiciary from the American model. The procedure for removing judges of the Supreme Court through impeachment is also inspired by the American system. Another important idea borrowed from the United States is the phrase "we the people" used in the preamble. The principle of equal protection of the law, which appears in Article 14 of the Constitution, also reflects American influence. Now let us look at Ireland. From the Irish Constitution, India borrowed the idea of directive principles of state policy. These principles appear in Part 4 of the Constitution and guide the state in promoting social and economic justice. India also borrowed the method of electing the president through an electoral college from Ireland. Another feature borrowed from Ireland is the provision allowing the president to nominate members to the Rajya Sabha. Now let us consider Canada. From Canada, India adopted the idea of a federal system with a strong central government. This is very important. Unlike the United States, where states enjoy very strong powers, the Canadian model gives greater authority to the central government. India also adopted the concept of residuary powers resting with the centre from Canada. Another feature borrowed from Canada is the advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Now let us move to Australia. From Australia, India borrowed the idea of the concurrent list. This is a list of subjects on which both the central government and state governments can make laws. Another feature borrowed from Australia is the principle of freedom of trade, commerce, and intercourse across the country. India also adopted the idea of a joint sitting of both houses of parliament to resolve legislative deadlocks. This provision appears in Article 108 of the Constitution. Now let us look at Germany. From the Weimar Constitution of Germany, India borrowed the concept of emergency powers, particularly the suspension of fundamental rights during a national emergency. Next, from France, India borrowed the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These ideas originated from the French Revolution and are prominently reflected in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. The concept of a republic, which appears in the phrase democratic republic, also reflects French influence. Now let us consider the Soviet Union. From the Soviet system, India later borrowed the concept of fundamental duties. These duties appear in Article 51A of the Constitution and were added through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment in 1976. The emphasis on social and economic justice in the preamble also reflects the influence of socialist ideas. The concept of five-year planning in India's economic policy was also influenced by the Soviet model, although it is not directly written in the Constitution. Next, from Japan, India borrowed the phrase, procedure established by law. This phrase appears in Article 21, which deals with the protection of life and personal liberty. Unlike the American concept of due process of law, India chose the Japanese wording, which was considered more suitable at the time. Finally, from South Africa, India borrowed the procedure for constitutional amendments. Article 368 requires a special majority of Parliament for many amendments, a concept influenced by the South African Constitution. India also adopted the method of electing members of the Rajya Sabha from the South African system. Now remember some very important points for UPSC. Directive principles of state policy were borrowed from Ireland. Fundamental rights were inspired by the United States. Fundamental duties were influenced by the Soviet Union. The parliamentary system came from the United Kingdom. And the federal system with a strong centre was inspired by Canada. Now let us quickly revise the key ideas. First, the framers of the Constitution studied more than 60 constitutions from around the world. Second, they did not simply copy these systems but carefully adapted suitable features to meet India's needs. Third, the most important structural source of the Constitution was the Government of India Act of 1935. And finally, the Constitution reflects ideas borrowed and adapted from many countries, including the United Kingdom, the United States, Ireland, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, the Soviet Union, Japan, and South Africa. In the next lecture, we will move forward and understand the salient features of the Indian Constitution and what makes it unique among the constitutions of the world.